Today on A Girl and a Gun, I am joined by author, filmmaker and documentarian Nick Bleszynski.
A Girl and a Gun, episode 23, filmed on the 10th of the 10th, 2013, Nick Bleszynski.
All you need to make a movie is a girl and a gun. Come along and join the party while you stare at the sun.
Hello, welcome to A Girl and a Gun, the show for filmmakers and content creators. And not as per usual, I do not have John Mazel sitting with me this time because I have a special guest, Nick Bleszynski. G'day, Nick.
Hi, Phil. How are you?
Good, good. We've got you here on a very fortuitous time because you've just made a documentary which you're in the final stages of editing, which is going to be going to air soon, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. I actually wanted to start further back in your career a little bit. First, I met you initially as a teacher here at CIFA, and you occasionally teach multi-camera and you've worked in television and that kind of area and commercial TV. But you're also an author, a published author. How many novels have you had published so far?
4, and I'm just finishing my 5th.
Just finishing your 5th. What was the first one?
The first one was called Shoot Straight, You Bastards.
Which is actually the subject of our documentary, so there it is.
Yep,
right.
absolutely.
So we'll talk more about that in a moment, because I want to talk at length about this one. The one that I remember reading, which was the last book you published, I think, was it?
Yeah, there's been one other since.
With one on Ben Hall.
Yeah, and there was another one called Pure Animal, which was a fiction.
And there's a fiction one, and then there was this one, Bloodlust, which was
historical fiction.
Alexander Pierce. So most of these are based on true life stories, though, aren't they? Historical stories.
Yeah, they are. They are. I mean, basically, I mix up. Some of my books have been straight non-fiction, straight historical fact, and then some other ones have needed the fictional touch because simply you don't know everything about the character. Alexander Pierce, for example, the cannibal convict, as he was known. We knew certain things about him. We had newspaper archive, we had certain accounts of him, but we didn't know everything. We didn't know what was inside his head, and that's what I added in the book.
And there's certainly a large period of that book because he escapes from the convict colony, and you never quite know what happened. We understand the end result of it, but it's like, what were they thinking? What drove them to what they did? And there's a lot of
and that's a novel. That's a novelist's craft, really. I mean, you know that Pierce escaped a very brutal convict colony in Tasmania, and he was the first white man.
The worst in Australia.
Yeah, the worst. Sarah Island, and he was the first white man to traverse the whole island of Tasmania. He went from the west coast back towards Hobart in the east, and he made it. He was the first person to ever survive that journey, and they started out with 7 of them, and only 1 survived. So what happened on the journey? And that's where we know Pierce survived, and we know roughly what happened, but the internal dynamics of that story, that's where the beauty is for a writer.
So how much, for a story like that where there's not a lot to go by, how much research nevertheless did you have to do?
Oh, an enormous amount. I mean, we knew things about Sarah Island. There was a lot of diaries and archive from the time, so I could reconstruct very faithfully the shell of the story and the historical context, because I believe that you need detail. I know modern writing nowadays, you don't describe anything, don't put any detail in, let people imagine everything for themselves. I'm a bit more old school, and I actually think people need to be immersed in the time. They need to learn that the world was different then. I mean, trying to read the book without historical context, it's very hard, because if you're living in 2013, how can you understand what 1852 was like in Australia?
1852, historically, that's not that long ago. There's enough that you can probably work off. Plenty of other records that aren't related to this story that you can draw from.
Exactly,
rather than doing a really ancient historical thing.
Exactly. So you do have a lot of detail. You do have a lot of, for example, the newspapers commented on the story a lot. So there was a lot. You could create the structure, the spine of the story, but there was so much.
Let's just say there's a great chunk there where you just had to invent what really happened, and then, you know, like any good novelist, trying to create the character, create the story, and still be true. How true were you to what historical fact there was?
Oh, 100%. As much as was there, what was up for grabs was what was in Pierce's mind. What changed him from a very meek and mild man who was sent to Australia for stealing 6 pairs of shoes.
Like so many convicts of that time,
Yeah.
innocuous crimes, yes.
Yeah. And so that was, so what changed him from a man who could steal 6 pairs of shoes into a convict killer?
6 shoes? What
Well,
is it?
I actually answered that question. I was so intrigued by it. The judge asks him, so what did you do on the 7th day? And he said, I never got out of bed. I stayed in bed with my girlfriend all day, so I never needed a pair for the Sabbath.
Because he wanted a pair for every day, right?
So I kind of, it did intrigue me as well. I mean, I'm glad you picked up on that. But that's really the art, if you like, as a filmmaker or as a novelist or a writer, you've got to try to see what's inside the characters. It's not enough just to know the surface, skiff the surface. You need to know in those cases what's there.
Because I'm also a would-be novelist and filmmaker, and you're also a filmmaker. How do you find the balance between writing for literary writing, novels, versus screenwriting, which you've done some of as well?
Well, personally, the reason I started writing books, to be quite honest, was that I thought to myself, well, you know, nowadays the industry being what it is, no one's going to pay me to write an original screenplay. So why don't I just write a book that then becomes the film? And that's happened successfully twice now to me. And I've written a book and I've put everything in it that I would expect to be in a movie.
Yep.
And I've written it in a very cinematic way. I tried to write it in a very visual style, and now I've had success with Breaker Morant has just been optioned as a movie.
Okay, so apart from the doco we'll talk about, there's also now a new movie version of the story.
Well, hopefully.
Hopefully. And also you've had some interest for your other book, which is about Ben Hall. Is that right?
That's right. That's being also made into a movie, and the Pierce film.
And there's now interest in this.
And that was made. That was actually made.
Oh, okay, because there was another version which was not based on this book,
yes,
I remember.
But there's now one that is being based on this book.
Okay, great.
So it was funny that, what do you call it, my author was always my publisher was always curious why I always fought to retain the movie rights to my books. Now they know.
Exactly. Well, let's move on to Shoot Straight to Bastard, which was your first book, your first bestseller, in fact, and it's the one that has been getting a lot of interest.
Yeah.
Let's start with the big question, which is, hasn't this story been told already in Breaker Morant?
The movie?
The movie?
It was, but that was 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, people didn't really know a lot about the case. They really had 1 or 2 books to guide them. And certainly the movie tells you that there's an injustice that's gone on. But it never went into it in the kind of depth that I believe needed to be done. Also, it didn't really tell us who Breaker Morant was as a man. In the movie, it's really a story. It's really a film about a trial. And so when I started to look at the story, I discovered very quickly that the film really had again gone to a superficial level. I mean, you only have a couple of hours to tell that story. It's a huge story.
Do you think the film, as limited as it was, still told what it did effectively?
Oh, yeah, I think it was a very passionate and a fantastic piece of filmmaking because it got you the underlying sense of injustice. It got to the sense that these Australians had been wronged. They had been scapegoated for the British Empire. That it got over. But in fact, when I started researching the story, the conspiracy was much darker and much larger than anything the film had ever conceived of. It is
a much bigger story than you can get into it.
Exactly, and that was the thing. And in the documentary series we just made is 98 minutes, and I think that we've got as much as we can into that film. But really, I would have liked another half hour. To be honest, I think the 2 hours would have just about been...
So you've just completed, you're spending most of this year, in fact, in shooting in Australia, South Africa, and England, all the locations involved here, of Breaker Morant from his very beginning, before he entered the army, in fact, I think. Is that right?
That's right. No, what we've done is go right back to the origins, who he was, because Morant died controversially, but his life was just as colourful. And that's what's not really been told to the Australian public yet, that Morant was born, he claimed, the bastard son of an English admiral. But when you look on his birth certificate, he comes from a very modest background. Yet here was a man who was a fantastic horsebreaker. So where did a man born to the poorhouse in England learn to ride a horse like that?
Let's find out, because we actually have a clip lined up that you've generously brought along, which tells us a little bit about how he got that name of Breaker Morant. Let's run that now.
Harry Harbord Morant was looking for a new start. And out here, they don't ask questions about your past, and they're loyal to their mates, and that gave him his chance. In this school of hard knocks, his character was shaped and the legend was born. You don't get called the Breaker for nothing. They said that Harry Morant was the most reckless man to ever throw his leg over a wild horse in Australia. A hard drinker, a hard puncher, he roared his way through the back blocks of Queensland into New South Wales, leaving a trail of death behind him. Along the way, he won a lot of purses as a jockey.
The bet's on. The bet. It's on.
And his deeds of daring do on horseback are still legend in outback town.
So that's where we got his name, because he actually was a breaker, a horse breaker.
He was indeed, yes. He arrived in Australia under one name. The irony is, again, of his story, he arrived in Australia as Edwin Henry Morant, and he died as Harry Harbord Morant. So why did he change his name? How could he be born as one person and die as another? That was the other curious thing about Morant's story. And really, there's a twin story in, was he innocent or guilty, or was he really from the English family, the landed gentry, the Morants, or was he really just a common Morant who was making up a good story? That's the twin dynamics we have running in the documentary.
Well, the other big thing about the documentary, of course, is the controversy about the trial, the original trial. And there's been a movement, and you've been part of this movement, to try and get his name expunged from the record, to have another look at that trial. And what would you say to have it? To
have basically the original verdict overturned. And in the research I did for Shoot Straight and subsequently the documentary, which revealed even more, as we went along, it just seemed as though there was more and more evidence falling out the cupboard.
So all of this, you still found out more relevant information.
There was more. I mean, for example, in the film, I won't give too much away, but there is evidence. I mean, Morant claimed that effectively they shot prisoners because they were ordered to do. The British had given them orders to do so. And
this is at the top?
At the top, from Lord Kitchener. And the British have claimed for 111 years that this is absolute fiction. There's none of it at all. And yet, in the film, there's a moment where we actually find the evidence in London, in the archives, and they knew about it all along. So I'll say no more, but effectively, I think that their excuses are about to be played out.
And you've also, in a way to verify that, you actually did. Do you want to talk about the trial that you actually did conduct?
Yes, we actually did. Again, I will say a little about it, but in the film, the centerpiece is, if you like, a staged retrial of what happened in 1902. They were denied an appeal. When you're condemned to death and going to be executed, it was your right as a soldier to appeal to the king. They were denied that appeal by Lord Kitchener, so we ran that appeal for them. So if they had been given the chance to appeal, if we could have examined the trial.
You gave them the trial they deserved, they should have had in the first place.
And in essence, I think it's very interesting viewing, because we had the creme de la creme of Melbourne's legal talent arguing the case, both for the Crown and defending Morant and Hancock. And in the end, it's a very interesting conclusion.
So do you think this is over?
I think we're well on the way. I do think there's now, there'll be, as a result of the film, I think there'll be a much better understanding of what really happened and all of the issues at hand, which I don't think there has been in the past. And I do think it clears the way to go to London to the High Court next year to actually officially have this case fought and overturned.
Because I know you've mentioned that the family, the Descendants, are still fighting this battle.
Of course.
To have his name cleared.
They've carried the burden of this guilt for 111 years on their backs. And a lot of people have been quite traumatized by it. And hearing the stories from the various relatives has been quite moving. People saying, well, my father could never talk about this. He could never talk about it because it was so painful. And there was great shame. And people said, oh, he's a Hancock or he's a Morant. And it was a source of shame. And of course, their names aren't on the honor roll. Yeah. Neither Morant, Hancock or Whitten. He was the third accused who wasn't actually executed. He was sent to prison for a couple of years but was then let go. But these people's names are not on the honor roll at the War Memorial, and they would like that. The families would like to say these men served.
Especially if their execution was unjust.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, at the end of the day, in a sense, it's setting the historical record straight. That's what's at stake. And I believe it's a stain on Australia's character, a stain on our history that should be removed. The British deserve the odium, not the Australians. And that's what, I guess, motivated me. If I had to go right back down to it, I think it's the sense of injustice, and I just felt it was wrong.
So the final act of this is yet to play out, really.
It is, but I think the film has set us up nicely for the denouement.
Okay, the film, how can we see it? Where will we see it?
It's going to be broadcast on the History Channel on the 11th of the 11th, Remembrance Day, so 11th of November. It will be on, and I'm sure you'll hear a lot about it in the media before it's broadcast.
Okay, and we saw a little bit of it there. It's 2 episodes?
It's going to be one.
One?
We've actually decided that it's such a compelling story that we put 2 episodes into one. Okay. So it's going to be one feature-length doco.
Right, and as you say, there's you've shot in 3 different countries.
Yeah.
There are reenactments. We saw a bit of reenactment there, but there's also modern day stuff of what's happening now with this case still to this day.
Yeah. So we follow the Jim Uncles, who's been the if you like the main driver behind the legal campaign. He's a military lawyer, and you see all his struggles and how he's been dudded by the British governments and the Australian governments, and how he's kept up the fight, maintained the rage.
Ultimately, hopefully, it'll overturn that original judgment. But do you think this will have a wider implication than just the Morant case?
I think I'm hoping that it will start getting Australians thinking about their history more. There are great historical stories that we have in this country, but they haven't been told. We basically have the Anzac story and Ned Kelly, and that's about it. But we have lots of great stories, and I'm hoping this will start a fashion for people going, yeah, maybe we should look at who we are. Stop worrying about what Americans are doing, what the British are doing. Start looking at who we are and what we're doing.
Talking filmmaking again, there was a period in the 70s there, at the time Breaker Morant was made, where we made a lot of these historical stuff.
Exactly. And
it's probably time to have another look back there and see all the stories that weren't told then.
Yeah. As a filmmaker, there's a treasure trove of stories waiting to be told. And I often said to people, this ironically, 111 years to make a documentary about Breaker Morant. If Morant had been anything other than Australia, there would be about 20 films about him now. And I think that's sad in a way. But I hope the film will kind of, if you like, show the way in that respect too.
Yeah. Meanwhile, you're actually working on a book right now, your latest project, which is not a historical reenactment, so to speak. It's actually straight fiction, is that right? Can you tell us much about that?
Yes, it's actually fiction, but again, it's being a historian at heart, there's always a bit of history in there. It's basically completely different to anything else I've done before. It's called The Witch Pricker, and it's set in Scotland in the medieval era. And where
You're Scottish, that's your background.
My background is originally from Scotland, and I actually grew up in the town next to Forres, which is where Macbeth is set. The great legend of Macbeth. And the witchcraft era was a very dark and very dangerous thing that people still don't even want to talk about in Scotland. And in Forres itself, there's a tower, the Tolbooth Tower, where all the witches were kept. And I remember going there on a guided tour. They opened it for some reason. It's usually closed. And it's a very dank and dangerous place that hasn't changed much since the medieval times. And we could go up these windy stone steps to the top. And at the top there's a rounded, the tower was rounded, and I remember saying to the guide, so why is it rounded? And they said, so the devil can't hide in the corners, which would say, like, everyone's sort of flesh came up with goosebumps straight away. And there was definitely a frisson in that room. And the guy could tell I was a bit interested. And when the other people had sort of started down this stairway, he said, let me tell you a story. He said, they put a witch up in this room around about the time of Macbeth. And they were and they said, and basically, this witch was going to be burned the next morning. And they put 2 guards at the door, and as you can see, there's no way to get out. There was a couple of slatted windows that effectively a cat could have got out. But then when you look down, it's about a 200-foot drop to the cobblestones on the high street. And you think, well, you couldn't get out. Yeah. If you did, you'd fall, and you'd die for sure. And they said, well, this witch was kept up by there all night. But when they came in the morning to get her for the burning, she was gone. And nobody knows how she got out.
This piqued your interest.
And I suddenly started thinking, well, who was she? And I looked at some of the records, and it turns out that this person they were going to burn had been apprehended in the town. She'd been a witch pricker, a person who'd gone round Scotland pricking witches. And in Scotland, when you're accused of being a witch, they had this rather unique thing where they pricked you with a large needle. And if there was a place in which you didn't bleed, that was where the devil had nipped you. And that was proof you were a witch. So you were pricked 100 times with this big needle. And I was thinking, my God, this is amazing Gothic stuff.
Yeah.
And this woman was posing as a man. And when they got the witch pricker, because they thought she was a bit crooked, they pulled off her cloak and found out she was a woman. And they thought it must be a witch in guise, you know, a woman dressing as a man, a woman dressing as a man. My God, she must be a witch. So they were determined to burn her. And strange things have been happening in the town.
This is a medieval story. We're talking about historical stuff. This is going way back now.
This is about 1600, early 1600s.
Yeah, so how was your historical research for this period?
Well, fortunately for me, it was bang in the middle of the witchcraft era. So there were a lot of local records around, and quite good records were kept by the church. They were the chief movers in burning witches. So they kept very good records. And so when you get right down into, you know, some pretty rare archives, there is a fair bit of detail about life of the time. And I think the witchcraft era has been quite popular, and quite a few books
well, there's
have
been a lot of stuff around, but they're sort of schlocky horror films and things like this. You know.
This to me was I promised more, because I had to reconstruct the life of this person. Why would you dress as a witch pricker and masquerade as a man? What was her secret? We don't know how she escaped, what became of her, or anything. So I worked from the end of the story and worked all my way back to the beginning.
Right.
So I created a complete fictional life in these times. And so I did a lot of research into what the customs were at the time, how people lived. For example, a woman could not travel on her own. If you were a woman, there's no way you could go anywhere without a man. You know, for even
just because it was too dangerous.
It was too dangerous. I mean, women would have been were regarded as fair game. Yeah. And so you would not have gone. So I thought that something must have compelled her to have gone out searching. What was she looking for? Why? Maybe that's why she was dressed as a man. She was looking for something. What's she looking for?
I can see you're deep into this because you're just finishing it, aren't you?
Yeah, and so this book has taken me nigh on 4 years to write. Okay. The longest endeavor ever, and it was been the most challenging, because you have to suddenly imagine the world as a woman, and when you're a man with no real effeminate side to him.
The best film around that era that I can think of currently is like Name of the Rose.
Yes.
The Sean Connery film, which was really earthy. Yeah. Because the other one I think of is that Vincent Price film, which I think I showed you, which was nice for what it was, and it was that kind of subject.
The Witchmaster General there,
yeah. Yeah, but that was like a Hammer horror film.
Yes.
It's a subject that historically could take... it needs a serious touch. It needs to be a really good, solid investigation. And this sounds like a really intriguing way of getting at it.
Yeah, I mean, I've really rebuilt her story, her whole life, and I've given her a life, and I've had it that she starts off with a double line in her hand. Apparently, it was a sign that you were cursed, you were blessed and cursed if you have a double line. You got to have a bit of a look there. But they apparently they had a cure wife who would come round to every newborn baby and tell them their destiny. The mother wanted to hear good things.
Yeah.
What's my child going to be? And on this child, the cure wife looks and sees the double hand, and she'll have two lives, one blessed and one cursed, one long and one short. And that's the basis, the seed for the
So when
intrigue.
can we hope to see that next year sometime?
Yes, we're just in the stage now of finishing it off. I need to have some serious editing done to it,
Right.
and then there's a long 6-month period while we fiddle around with it and get it right for the market. So I'm hoping next year, the Witchbreaker.
But meanwhile, the series based on this book and further research, which is called, what's the actual series going to be called on the History Channel?
It's called Breaker Morant: The Retrial.
Breaker Morant, the retrial on November the 11th.
Yep.
On the History Channel.
Yep.
And is there any other way to say it if you don't have Foxtel? Well, currently that's the plan.
It will be a DVD release,
Eventually,
and
good.
hopefully, once the story is finally finished, there will be a cinematic release as well of the whole story.
And we can do another.
Indeed.
Exactly. Terrific. Nick Bleszynski, thank you so much for coming.
No
and telling
worries,
us
Phil.
about your project. I'm looking forward to the documentary. In fact, I know how long you've been working on that one.
Yeah,
as
it's
well. And it's an important story to say. So it's important for Australia and England relations, honestly.
Yeah, I might not do them any good, but the truth has to be told.
Thank you very much for coming in, Nick. Great
No
to
worries,
talk.
Phil. Thanks. Cheers.
And that's it for this episode of A Girl and a Gun. We'll see you all next time with I don't know who our next guest is going to be, but thank you all, and that's a wrap.